Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn their amazing stories. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a handshake exposed and explore the risk that comes when a deal is not in writing.
A handshake deal? Wait, have that not heard of COVID-19? Well, I guess with COVID-19, is a handshake deal, as we know it, dead?
Well, fair point. Maybe it will be called an elbow agreement in the future, but seriously, we're from Texas, and the idea of a handshake is romanticized. And as we know, handshakes today still happen. We see them all the time with our clients. Today, we'll explore through this story the actual downside risk to doing a deal with a handshake.
All right, Michael, you've been practicing law for probably over 20 years now, and I'm sure you've had a bunch of cool different stories. Can you share like a really interesting short story? And in this case, make sure it's family friendly.
So I received a phone call several years ago from a physician client and a friend. He said he had a buddy who was his neighbor and that he was an awesome spine surgeon who was finishing his first 2 years of employment with a prominent practice. And it was time for the buy-in. And he said, for purposes of this story, we'll call him Dr. Young Gun.
Wait. Why Dr. Young Gun?
Well, he was the best of the best, and he was already at that stage performing some of the most complicated spine surgeries in the country. And really, his fellowship training and training prior to that was setting him up for these complex cases that, on average, were north of 10 hours per surgery.
Okay, number one, I will allow this name, Dr. Young Gun. And then number two, if I remember the story correctly, he was working with some senior doctor that was pretty darn famous also in his own right.
Well, it's funny you say that, Brad, because for this story, we're going to call the senior doctor Dr. Famous. Dr. Famous was the sole owner of the practice.
And for the audience who's, for a little context here, you have to understand something. It's very common, especially for closely held private medical practices, when they're bringing on a new physician. They'll bring them out of residency or they'll bring them out of their fellowship. And part of that process when they bring them on is there's always this great offer in 2 to 3 to 5 years for that person to become an owner of the practice.
And we handle this scenario so many times. I mean, today, for really our whole career, this is the most common private practice scenario. The difference here, which made it so memorable, even without the story that really made it unforgettable, that we'll talk about soon, and made it fascinating, is that both doctors had leverage, and at the same time, they really needed each other. Dr. Famous had leverage because he was the owner of the practice, and he was established in the market. I mean, he was Dr. Famous.
He was Dr. Famous, yet he had brought on Dr. Young Gun, who is also in his own right pretty good at what he did. And again, because as you said, very limited people in the country could do what these doctors did. So he actually had some options of his own if he ever decided to leave the area.
Exactly. And they had invested a few years in building and growing the practice together. What we all thought and what everyone believed was that this buy-in was going to be a win-win for everybody.
And now I'm starting to have a feeling that we would not be talking about this story if it's a simple win-win situation.
Fair enough. And yes, we were hired to help Dr. Young Gun, and the negotiations immediately got off on the wrong foot. Dr. Young Gun was not happy with the valuation, and Dr. Famous seemed uninterested in negotiating.
Yeah, Michael, I think one of the things people need to understand is, especially when it comes to practice valuations, this is often a very sticky topic with any owner, and especially with physicians. Look, if you go talk to a lot of doctors, that their locker room talk, or when they sit around the room, they say, look, your practice has no value whatsoever. Or other times, you have a selling physician, especially those who are famous, who often overvalue their actual practice. So in this particular case, with Dr. Famous, his negotiating skills were, look, this is this is what the value is worth, and after all, he was famous.
Yeah, and I think all of us can relate in a way to this. If you've sold a house before, we always overvalue what we think our house is worth to the outside world versus what the market says. And, this was clearly a situation with where we were right now on this deal. And Dr. Younggun set his boundaries, and he expected the deal to be negotiated. And so it went from bad to worse quickly.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I remember I was pretty shocked the day you walked in and said, yeah, this is not going well. I go, how bad? You're like, well, so bad that he gave notice that he's terminating his employment with them, and he's ready to try to figure out what his plan B is going to be. So, the dream scenario that everyone kept thinking was going to happen was quickly coming to a close here.
Everyone was dug in. The interesting development that was super awkward were the several weeks that ensued. They continued to operate together, and they didn't discuss the imminent departure that was about to happen. I would talk to Dr. Younggun regularly, and he didn't have a potential opportunity he was looking at or any updates on what was going to happen as this clock was expiring on his contract. And neither of them were making a move to move forward with a separation. Neither of them would talk.
So what finally broke the stalemate?
Dr. Famous quietly mentioned as they were operating together that it would be beneficial for them to figure out a way to work it out.
Now, if I remember correctly, at this infamous meeting now, Dr. Younggun was there, you were there, Dr. Famous and his attorney, and it was all at the hospital. And the hospital had different conference rooms, and one was a tiny, super cramped room where pretty much when you shut the door, you're lucky that it didn't hit your chair while you're seated there.
Yes, and it was super early on a Friday morning. Dr. Famous had a vacation to go to by 7:30 that day.
Right. He was a big, if I remember correctly, outdoor guy and loved mountain biking. Is that right?
He was an avid cyclist. This was his summer vacation. So we're talking early, before 6 a.m. on an August morning. And the meeting was hard, but it went surprisingly well. We met for over an hour and a half and literally shook hands on a deal as Dr. Famous was going to make his flight.
And again, I remember that morning you came to the office that Friday morning and said, hey, we got this deal done. Can you believe it? We're super pumped. We need to start putting these documentation together so we can get them to Dr. Famous's attorney for next week.
Yeah, and that's how the story ended. It was great. Oh, well, just kidding.
Almost.
On Monday morning, I received another phone call, again, memorably early, from Dr. Younggun. Dr. Famous had died of a heart attack while mountain biking.
I every time I hear the story and we talk about it, it's so shocking because you had a moment in time where everything was perfect and then it wasn't.
Yeah, in a matter of a weekend, Dr. Younggun went from a handshake to no contract and no boss. And this began another weird period where Dr. Younggun kept working and kept getting paid under his old contract. But remember, he terminated his contract. So he was getting paid on a contract that didn't even exist anymore. What was really interesting is he stepped in and started making the day-to-day decisions because the staff needed direction, and he was the only physician that was at this practice.
Yeah, this is a wild story, and I think, I'm trying to figure it out myself. Like, what should Dr. Younggun do? What are his next steps? I mean, you just said he doesn't have a contract, or does he have a contract? I'd love for us to figure these things out, but I think we should do that after the break.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back. Michael, you just told us this incredible story. We had conflict, we had resolution, we had future partners and aha moments, and then an unexpected death. And nothing is charming about death, but there is something charming about a moment in time when Dr. Young Gun and Dr. Famous, pre-COVID people, stood up at the end of a heavily negotiated meeting. They put their hands out together and they shook it, and that to them sealed the deal.
For sure. I mean, even if Dr. Famous had not died, I know that this would be one of those memorable moments in my career because it was so powerful after all the conflict that had built up over the prior several months. And the idea of a handshake to seal the deal is so relational. I mean, the meeting on that Friday, as I said, it was powerful. It was a bro hug moment.
And why do you think that's so important?
Well, it's an extreme example of what can go wrong when you don't have a written contract. I mean, think about this. In this particular case, they intended to sign a contract. You and I met, Friday morning immediately afterwards to start getting things in gear to draft it. So it wasn't anything other than just really unfortunate timing that there was no signed contract. And, the fact that we had a, almost Hollywood timing of his death just gives us a real life example of living through the consequences when there's not a contract.
And so probably a lot of people in the audience right now, Michael, are wondering, okay, but is a handshake an enforceable contract?
So this happened in Texas, and so what's relevant is that state law dictates whether or not you can have a contract. Oral contracts are enforceable in Texas, and in fact, they're enforceable in most states. So an argument could be made that the handshake at the end of the meeting bound everyone to an oral agreement, but that never really became a focal point of this story, as both of the attorneys were in the room and we had the guts of a transition plan in place. So we had other consequences that were not anticipated due to Dr. Famous's death.
So let's talk about some of those consequences then.
Well, Dr. Young Gun was really smart because he knew that if he did not take care of the patients, there would be nothing to work out.
Smart.
He also knew that taking care of the employees was critical to keep the office operating. And so we were negotiating to buy the practice with a grieving widow, and it was an emotionally charged situation. What was fascinating was that the widow happened to be a doctor, and so that actually created some negotiating challenges because technically she was allowed to own the medical practice. Yet, at the end of the day, remember, this is a famous best of the best practice, and there weren't any other real buyers out there. And so Dr. Young Gun was the only person that could buy the practice.
Yeah, and I think for the audience to understand, whenever someone's selling their practice or any business, it's already going to be emotional. And unfortunately, with death, it adds a whole new element to the emotions because of the something that Dr. Famous had built, and then the widow, obviously, this was her husband's dream. But not every handshake is going to end like this situation with the death of Dr. Famous. And then having no contract for Dr. Young Gun. Let's talk about what some of the other common risks with the handshake deal, though, in general, Michael.
Well, we talk about this all the time, Brad, when we're giving our speeches as it relates to any arrangement. The first reason that you don't want to do a handshake is that there are communication gaps that can create a huge risk for unmet expectations. One person can communicate at a high level of something that's important, and the other person agrees at a high level, but they may not have fully connected on that point. And so let's use kind of the physician employment as an example of what can happen on a handshake, and unfortunately what we've seen before happen on a handshake. So let's say, for example, Brad, that my client tells your client that he'll pay him 50% of net collections, and your client says yes. You tell me where there could be a disconnect.
Well, before I give you where there's a disconnect, I want the audience to use today's vocabulary word, which is net collections. And the best part about this answer is it's going to answer your disconnect. because the vocabulary word net collection can mean so many different things. And so what I think it can be and you think it could be completely different. And this is where some unmet expectations could come to fruition. So let's talk about that. Number one is, first, it could be that when you talk about collections, what's the source of those collections? Where are they coming from? So typically a physician, they make their money by operating or seeing a patient. That's known as professional fees. So am I getting paid on my professional net collections? Or when I refer a patient to a surgery center or to x-rays or some other type of ancillary, those are known as technical or facility fees. Am I receiving the benefits of those net collections? So that's the first thing. And the second issue is, what about me as a physician? If I want to go out and work on nights and weekends, is that included? What if I want to do some public speaking? We have a lot of those, or expert witness. Is that also included in my net collections? And then, of course, the term net by itself, we could just break that term all by itself. Is that collections as it lists to less refunds or less overhead? So there's major differences in the outcome of just that one term that we were just playing with. And so it's critical, as Michael said in the very beginning of, if this was an oral contract, there's a lot of things we didn't get to play with. But even in a written contract, when something comes as simple as a term of net collections, really truly understanding what that definition means is essential to making sure that the expectations are met.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Brad, we know, without being able to get into it on this episode, that they could have an oral agreement where they're going to agree to get paid a technical fee or facility fee, and they may trigger huge healthcare issues, regulatory issues. And so not only are they not connected, but they may be doing something that could get them into big trouble.
I feel like you're telling me there's a story out there that we may be telling in a future podcast.
Yes, another episode to be named. But we will let's move on to kind of the second reason you can get in trouble with these oral agreements, the handshake deal. And that's that there's no way in a handshake that all the things that should be discussed will be discussed. These are two doctors negotiating a deal. These aren't two lawyers coming to terms orally on a deal. And so we all know a handshake covers the most basic things in the deal. These undiscussed things are recipes for future conflict. And as we know, conflict arises from unmet expectations that they're carrying. And so whenever there's this non-alignment, there's a recipe for trouble. So let's talk again in context to a physician employment agreement. When they made the handshake, did they talk about how malpractice insurance would work? I know, and they wouldn't have talked about what happens if things go bad and this contract is terminated, or what are some of the benefits? How is CME going to work? Is that paid vacation? Is the practice paying for CME? And those are just scratching the surface on things that are not going to be discussed orally, but you will find in almost every physician employment agreement.
Yeah, and those are a perfect example of terms and conditions that should be fleshed out inside the actual agreement. But then there's other things that they don't even realize that aren't enforceable unless it's in writing. And in many states, like, again, we're talking about Texas in this particular case, if you wanted to have a non-compete, it actually has to be in writing, and there's a whole bunch of other pieces that go with it. Or if you're doing a real estate deal and trying to sell land, that actually has to be in writing too. So there are certain things that even if we wanted to do a handshake deal, it wouldn't have worked.
The bottom line, unmet expectations are a relationship killer.
And so based off this, what advice could you give the audience?
A couple things, Brad. Most people intend to document. They just don't prioritize. So number one, make it a priority. We see this in particular with buy-sell agreements and operating agreements. And at the beginning of a relationship, it's a new relationship, and that's exciting. Everything thinks everything's going to go right. And it's a buzzkill to have a sobering conversation about details and what happens when something goes wrong. Most people know they need to do it, but it's the thing that gets kind of getting pushed down the list. And then the second thing is turn into the hard conversations on the front end and then put it in writing. Beyond the delay idea that we just talked about, people also avoid. It's awkward to talk about what will happen if the two do not get along. Yet for relationships that work and are the healthiest, we see that they deal with the messy conversations.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on that, Michael. It's often is when you find someone saying, I don't really want to deal with that right now, because what if they don't sign the agreement? Then they become their partner down the road, and they didn't deal with the hard conversation. And because of, as you just articulated, those two major issues, it can blow up down in their face later, and that's when we see these doctor divorces.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because how they interact during this phase is a great indicator of how they're going to be married together when they have a contract, whether it's just an employment agreement or even more, they're partners.
Absolutely agree. So let's go back to our story. Michael, what happened at the end? Did Dr. Younggun eventually buy this practice?
Well, we love happy endings, Brad. So it would be really sad if we told this whole story and then had a really devastating ending. So thankfully, although negotiations took forever, because remember, Dr. Younggun couldn't even come to a deal when his partner was alive. I mean, that was the whole source of issues. So we then, when Dr. Famous had passed away, it was even more complicated. But we did end up getting the practice acquired. Everyone was happy with the outcome at the end. And to this day, Dr. Younggun is a client of ours and has a thriving practice.
What an awesome story. Thank you for sharing. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.